welcome along to this webinar looking at charity finance systems, and we're going to be looking at some of the challenges that we see day to day when we speak to a variety of different charities, and hopefully trying to solve those using iplicit. So just to set the scene, my name's Tom McEntee from Eureka Solutions. I've been with the business for nearly 8 years and worked in various roles, which is support, implementation, and now having the pleasure of doing things like today, introducing iplicit and talking about some of the challenges that I've faced over those 8 years. Joined by my, I'm going to say colleague, but he does work at iplicit, but we feel like colleagues, Dane, who I'll let introduce himself, who's going to help us along with the webinar this morning.
No, thanks very much, Tom, and thank you very much for having me, and good morning to everybody on the webinar. So yeah, my name's Dane. I'm one of the solutions consultant team here at iplicit. So ultimately I support our internal sales team and all our fantastic partners with Tom at Eureka on all of the solution demonstrations, taking prospects and customers through the functionality and how, you know, it can transform the finance departments for our customers and prospects. So when we get there during the session today, I'll be doing the heavy lifting of taking you through the product and showing you all of the great features and functions that the software has. So once again, thank you for joining, everybody, and it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks, Tom.
Lovely. Well, just to go through a quick agenda of how the session will run this morning, we've already went through the introduction, so thank you to Dane for introducing himself, and as I say, he will be doing a lot of the heavy lifting, so you'll be glad to know it won't be my Scottish accent that will be taking us through most of the session. But I'll certainly we'll start off with a little bit of an iplicit introduction, just to set the scene as to why we're doing the webinar this morning, a little bit about iplicit, but then going in quickly to we've kind of pinpointed 5 key challenge areas that we've come across in our experience of working with charities, and I know there'll be many that will resonate with a lot of the people that are on the webinar this morning. And then we'll go into, as we're doing that, jump into the iplicit software and actually see how we can solve those challenges within iplicit. We'll then finish on a little bit about Eureka Solutions and our partnership with iplicit, and then we can get into that Q&A as we said. So if you've got any questions, as I say, once again, just pop them into the chat facility and we will get those answered. So I think it would just be good to introduce iplicit to start off, just about why we're doing the webinar and in terms of how we've come to the point of doing a webinar on charity finance. So just a little bit about the background to iplicit, and hopefully that will set the scene for the rest of the session. So iplicit is full cloud-based accounting software that is really tailored and really nice for charities. But in terms of where it's came from, it actually started as a kind of brainwave, for want of a better phrase, from those who were at Exchequer, who people on the call may have not used, a very successful on-premise solution. But what iplicit saw was a real gap in the software market in terms of wanting to go to a full cloud solution that had that full functionality of a huge ERP system, but at a less complex and a more kind of affordable price point. What we found was, and what iplicit found was, that there was a real gap where you would be using maybe something like Sage 50, on-premise solutions like Exchequer, maybe the likes of Xero and QuickBooks for ones that have came to the fore now, but there wasn't that natural next step without making a real big jump into something that's quite daunting and complex and would take a lot of time. So hence why iplicit then came to the fore. So it's been around since 2019 and has really grown since then, as you can see with some of the stats on the screen there, with over 30,000 daily users of the software, over 1,500 organisations across the UK and beyond using iplicit. And the actual team itself, and Dane will attest to this, has grown massively over those years with over 110 people. And as Dane rightly said, he's helping out today with ourselves at Eureka, who are one of the leading partners for iplicit. And that's a real way that iplicit is looking to grow in terms of that partner network and shared experiences for ourselves, having worked with charities, really helps in terms of getting the bandwidth out there. Won plenty of awards over the time as well, in terms of and in a short space of time as well. So a lot of accountancy awards over the last few years, You can see there, Accountancy Excellence winner, and that's something that iplicit really prides himself on, is being a really sound accounting software. So those awards are a real vindication of how strong the software is. But I won't spend too much time on that. I'll let Dane do the talking. And then similarly on this slide, this just gives an idea of some of the things that we can do within iplicit. So for example, we'll touch on a lot of these, like so partial VAT, a bit of budgeting, reporting, but it can really stretch into other areas as well. So that's the beauty of the system. We can start off small and then actually go into lots of different areas. And I dare say you'll see some of the boxes there that maybe resonate with some of the challenges that you're having at this minute in time. And don't worry, we'll get into those as we go through the webinar this morning. So we won't spend too much time here, but just to give an idea of the broadness of iplicit, but then we'll go into some of the actual key functionality for charities over the next 40 minutes or so, and Dane will go into some of that actually within the software. In terms of some of the features for charities and some of the work that iplicit's done with charities, that's a really important slide to really indicate why we're doing the webinar this morning. So as you can see from the right-hand side, iplicit and ourselves have worked with many charities over the last few years, and many have shared similar challenges, hence why we've put the webinar together today, to really bring some of them to the fore and see how we can start to tackle some of those challenges. And it's really good to do it in a webinar setting where because it's really, really interesting to see when we speak to different charities how much the landscape is similar. Even though charities are doing different things and serving a different purpose and helping different people, the challenges within the finance team sometimes are the same. So as I say, I won't go into too much detail here in terms of the iplicit software and the features, but some things like your SORP and SOFA reporting, being able to do partial VAT, being able to have multiple entities easily handled in one system. So you might have that charity, you might have that full charity side, you might have a trading side, for example, a little shop, for example, that has to be in its own entity. Reporting, massive piece, and we'll come, that's probably a spoiler, that'll be one of the first things that we'll speak about, and also integrations to other systems as well. So iplicit has all of this functionality that's really catered to charities and some of their challenges. And as you can see from the right hand side of the screen, lots of charities that we've worked with and iplicit have worked with, and really helped them move from that kind of on-premise side, where some of these challenges were really, really at the forefront, just because the software wasn't able to really help them and adapt in a way that allowed them to save time and be more efficient. So we'll probably start to go into some of these challenges now, and we've pinpointed 5 different challenge areas that we've seen over our time of working with multiple different charities. And so we've split them into 5 different areas. And the first one is really, really important, and one that's anytime that I've spoken to any charitable or non-profit organisation is really top of the list. And it's really top of the list across the board. It's not just with charities, to be honest. Reporting from your system is one of the key bedrocks of why we use accounting software, and it really is the end point of what we're doing day to day. So there's 3 kind of key areas from when we've spoken to charities where reporting can be quite difficult. Especially those that I've spoken to a lot who have used software like Sage 50, for example, which is a great little product, but maybe doesn't have the flexibility when it comes to reporting from the system. So some of the key things that we hear when we speak to charities is the lack of flexibility when it comes to reporting for different dimensions, with fund and grants being 2 of the main ones. So there's a real need and a real challenge to report by your traditional, say, cost centre, department, but we want to now add to that. We want to report by fund, whether that be restricted, non-restricted, something that comes up all the time. So what I've seen from my experience, and Dane can add to this, is that a lot has been done in Excel. So you're exporting a lot to Excel, doing pivot tables within Excel, adding other columns and rows into Excel, which is great and fine. But if we can start to do that within the software, then that will give us a real starter for 10 and save you having to do that first step. And I'm sure Dane will come on to show how iplicit can help with that.
I agree with that, Tom. You know, when we speak to charitable organisations, it's clear the amount of time that they're spending manually manipulating data outside of the platform. They're doing these activities each and every month. The data that they're extracting is out of date as soon as it's extracted out of the system. They're constantly having to do multiple variations of those reports. So there's a lot of time, there's a lot of inconsistency. And of course, all of this manual work that we're spending on data outside of the system is open to risk and error. And one of the huge things that a lot of our customers and prospects are talking to us about is how can we bring that into that platform? How can we have a live view? How can we have flexibility at our fingertips to look at real-time data? And that's a huge driving force of iplicit and the functionality it has.
Yeah, absolutely. And just before Dane gets into showing a little bit about how iplicit can help within reporting, I think some of the key things as well, Dane, that I've heard from charities is that second point there in terms of struggling to get charity-specific reports out in terms of your statement of financial activity is one that comes up all the time, and getting it into the right format, and just being SORP compliant as well is really important. So what we are finding is a lot of finance teams and finance professionals are having to adapt in other means to be able to meet these criteria, when really if you can find software that can do that for you, it's just a real strain to that headache that's there all the time with reporting. And I think Dane touched on that kind of final point of the time that's just been wasted in doing that, and probably is a nice segue, Dane, into probably showing a little bit about iplicit and how that can help from a reporting point of view.
Yeah, fantastic, Tom. Thank you. So I think there's a few areas in which we can break this down. And firstly, one of the biggest challenges we find for our prospects is that the struggle of being able to analyze this data by fund or by grant, as you mentioned a little bit earlier, Tom, and a lot of the time having to do all of this off system in spreadsheets. So the first thing to note here before we go through examples is we've got a dedicated funds area within iplicit where ultimately you can configure your different types of funds, your restricted funds, your unrestricted funds, and then you've got the individual funds themselves that actually sit underneath those headers and those umbrellas. So we've got a really nice dedicated area where all of those fund and fund types can be managed. Now, in addition to that, when we go into our chart of accounts, and the chart of accounts isn't really the focal point of what I want to come on to here, because ultimately your chart of accounts can be any structure, any format, any grouping and nesting that you wish. But one of the powers of iplicit is that we have completely unlimited tracking dimensions, which ultimately means whenever we're utilizing those codes on a transaction, there's specific data that we're wanting to capture and pinpoint to use for reporting purposes. Now, within some software systems that I'm sure some of the attendees today is probably used to, there's limitations around that. There's a department, there's a cost center, and a lot of that extra work is being done off system. Whereas within iplicit, you have completely unlimited dimensions and tracking codes. There is no restriction, there is no limit, and you can create as many of those as you wish. And at the same time, there's rules and there's controls around how that data is captured. Is it automated from a user's setting? Is it fixed? Is it optional? Is it mandated? So this data has to be captured to drive consistency and accuracy when it comes to our output and our reporting. So that just gives you a bit of background into what the functionality is going to give you, which we go through now. So if we were to navigate into the general ledger, for example, and within here, we've got our balance sheet, we've got our TB, we've got our profit and loss or income and expenditure. And all of these work in the same way. So firstly, the thing to note here is that what I'm looking at is a pretty common format in terms of financial year and period. But as Tom mentioned at the opening there, we are a unified consolidated system. So within your organizations, if you have got multiple entities, if you've got maybe multiple charities, trading arms, we can roll up all of that financial data and consolidate it out of the box as standard. What we can also have is we can have configurable different views running along the top. So if actually I wanted to segregate that by entity and have a side-by-side comparison of how the charitable organization is looking versus the trading entity, but all within one view, we can view it in that way. You may want to view that by cost center or department. So it's a click of a button to begin to dissect that data and structure it in any way that you wish. Now, in addition to that, all of these reports are configurable and drill downable. So if I'm querying any of this information, I can drill down, I can see all of the underlying transactions, and we can drill right into the source transaction, even into the general ledger postings. So getting deeper and drilling into the data is swift, it's quick, and it's straightforward. But coming back to what we were talking about earlier about the dimensions and the funds, where we have this cog on the right-hand side, this essentially gives you a live interactive pivot table within iplicit for you to live in real time slice and dice that data in any way that you wish. So it may be, for example, we wanted to search by legal entity. We can search on that attribute. We can drag and drop that in, and all of a sudden we've got it split out in that way. Underneath that, we may want to add an extra layer. So we may want to break that down by projects or events or initiatives that we've got going on within the organization. So you can see how simple and straightforward it is to just slice and dice that data interactively in real time as we need to, just by a simple drag and drop. Now, in addition to that, what we also have is we have what we call a dynamic chart of account structure. And this is ultimately where we can have different configurations and different formats of your reports that you can just toggle between as and when you have to analyze it in a slightly different way or format. So it may be from an internal finance team point of view, we analyze it in one way, but actually for our committee, we want to actually roll that into a slightly different format. And of course, as Tom was mentioning, we have all your formats around SORP and SOFA compliance out of the box. So we can just toggle between these different formats as and when we need without needing to exit iplicit whatsoever. Now, to also give you a secondary example, this is an example of what it looks like from a funds perspective. So again, I can just simple drag and drop to organize by fund type and fund. I could save that as a set view along the top here if it's a view that I wanted to constantly refer back to. And this then allows me to slice and dice my data and analyze our funds and our income and expenditure by those different fund types and those different restricted and unrestricted funds that sit underneath. So it's live, it's real time, they're interactive, and you can slice, dice, and configure that data in any way that you want, all natively and directly within iplicit.
Super. And do you know, it's going back to what you said right at the beginning in terms of those rules, it just makes that whole reporting piece easier, because it will maybe force users who maybe forget or don't know to put it in. As you say, you can make it mandatory and you can fix it. It just makes that reporting at the end piece, which is so flexible as what you've just shown, it just makes that whole piece a lot easier. So no, it's really interesting to see how that can work. And as you say, it's almost like having an Excel pivot table within iplicit. So no, it's really interesting. Thank you, Jane, for going into that kind of insightful tour of the reporting side. So hopefully that's given an idea of how iplicit can help from that point. And we'll probably come back to that as we touch on some of the different areas. As we say, reporting is the bedrock of everything. But another one of the kind of key challenge points that we see is just across the board a lack of automation. And this can come in various different forms. So I've pinpointed a few here, and the reason I've done those is really just because it comes up quite frequently when we talk about automation. Now, automation can come in lots of different formats, as I've said, and that can be part of your reporting. But there's also different routines that we see that can take finance teams, especially in the charity sector, a lot of time. So ones that I've pinpointed here are like some prepayment schedules and being able to, so for example, you get, say, a rent invoice or whatever it may be, and having to prepay that, but you want to recognise that across different months or periods. Also, that whole intercompany transaction side of things as well. So we worked with one charity in particular who had, I think, 4 different entities. One was that kind of trading arm, or I think 2 were those were trading arms, and then another subsidiary within there as well. And they had a lot of intercompany trade where they were sending, say, like purchases across them. They wanted to share different overheads and things. So being able to do transactions between companies was something that was quite important. There was just no automation of that. It was doing one in one company and then replicating it in the other and having to get it right every time. And one thing that they said was the amount of mistakes that were being made by no fault of anyone. It's a repetitive task, and we're all human after all. I would be the exact same. If you're doing those transactions twice, you make a typo, nothing matches up, nothing reconciles. Another area when it comes to automation that we hear all the time when we speak to charities is the partial VAT management. So a lot of systems don't handle it particularly well. And it's just because it's not been at the forefront of when the software's been developed. We're thinking standard VAT, 20%, that'll be fine. But for organisations like charities where there's partial exemptions or maybe even full exemptions, that can be a bit of a struggle. So I think, Dane, it would be good probably to have a wee look at the software in terms of that whole automation piece. And there's a whole automation centre. I don't want to steal your thunder in any way, but there's a whole automation centre within iplicit, which I think could really help with that kind of automation side of things.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think for the benefit of the audience, it doesn't just stop there. You know, there's broader automation across the entire platform, whether that's automated bank feeds, automated reconciliation, automated supplier invoice scanning. So we've got AP automation baked into the tool. So we have automations system wide. But I think coming back to those pertinent points that you mentioned there, Tom, absolutely. We have one of our underlying core components of the software is, as you've mentioned, our automation center. And it does exactly that. It automates processes that a lot of our prospects, when we're talking to them, are doing this activity manually, whether that's manually off system when it comes to calculation partial exemption, whether it's manually as part of their month-end routines, having to go and deal with their prepayments or asset depreciation each and every month. We've got automations that can handle all of that. So, you know, we've got accruals, depreciation, penny corrections, prepayments. We have got a whole suite of automations that deal with this activity on an automated basis each and every month. And to give you an example of that, if I was to just come into my purchases area and go to my purchases invoice, I've got an example to just quickly run through. So here's an example purchase invoice. It's coming from a particular supplier. It's for insurance and it's at £1,200. Now, what we can do against that account code is we can flag whether we typically prepay against that code. And if that is then ticked, when we add that account code onto the invoice, or if that's scanned in automatically, it recognizes that that is a prepaid account and gives us the prepayment option. And within here, what we then have the flexibility is denoting the profiles of how we want to spread that cost over a period of time to release it through to the P&L. And these are configurable. So it may be that it's a 3-month policy, a 6-month policy, a year, 2 years, 3 years, whatever that profile is. And we also have the flexibility of having an equal amount per month, or we can even divide it to a daily amount and then can apportion based on the amount of days in each month. So we've got a lot of flexibility. But ultimately, once we've entered the profile at source and we've submitted that through, that would go through for an authorization workflow, which we'll cover off on another topic later. But then against that invoice, it generates as this prepayment tab. So ultimately, what we can do here is we can see the schedule of how we're going to release that cost over the period of the profile that we've set. And our automation center will kick in and each and every month create and post those journals to the P&L. So there's no manual activity. It cuts the month-end procedures down drastically because all of these is just handled on an automated basis. And what we can do from here is we can drill into the journal, we can drill into the general ledger posting. So everything's really simple and easy to wrap with as and when we need to delve a little bit deeper. But the core and the crux of this is that it's automated and driven by our automation center. Now, in addition to that, and you absolutely hit another key area, which is around intercompany movements. So we won't go into the detail of this all right now, but ultimately within iplicit, we're a fully unified platform, and we have a whole intercompany matrix where we can control and define what intercompany transactions flow through our different entities within the organization. So you're in control of all of those movements. But again, within our automation center, we've got automations that drive the activity. So if I was to just come into, let's use an intercompany sale invoice as an example. I'm raising an intercompany sale invoice from our charity company to our trading company for some particular lines and services and values, and I want to submit that through. And what you'll see here is, as I've generated that intercompany sale between those two companies within the group, our automation center has kicked in and automatically created the mirror image purchase invoice transaction in the other company, all mapped, all coded automatically on the other side. So there's no double entry, there's no manual rekeying of data. It's quick, it's automated, and it's controlled because we have all of those mappings under the hood that essentially eradicates the risk of human error, which we can all be prone to, of course. Now, they're just a few examples. There are lots more within that automation center, and if anyone's got any questions, feel free to put them into the chat. The final area is around partial exemption. Now, I've worked with a number of charities, and this can go from being really simplistic to really granular and complex. And the beauty with iplicit is we've got a dedicated matrix that can control all of that. So the first thing to note here is that we can create what we call a tax group. And within that tax group, we can denote what entities form part of that group. So they can be one-to-one or one-to-many. And what we then have is a flag to denote, is partial exemption applicable? If it is, we have options to control how the GL postings are managed. So do we want to increase certain values and reduce others? Do we want to add extra lines on for the recoverable VAT, and so on and so on? And we've certainly got some examples that we can share if we need to go into this in more detail. But what we then have is we've got a partial exemption matrix, and this is where we can control the scope as to when those partial recoverability percentages come into play or not. So first of all, we can have dates around these percentages. We've got the actual recoverable percentage itself, and then we've got a whole matrix that controls when this comes into play and when it doesn't. So it could be tied to particular account codes. It could be tied to particular entities, cost centers, departments, if it's tied to a particular fund or project. So we've got lots of flexibility that drives when these come into play or when they don't. So to give you a very quick and high level example, if I was to go and put a purchase invoice onto the system for the charitable organisation, and let's just use Carriage as an example here, what you'll see here is my recoverable percentage at the moment is at 100% because it's not met the scope of what's in that matrix. However, if I was to change my entity to the Exeter Hotel, I can now see that the system has automatically set that recoverable percentage to 87% because it's identified when we use this account code for this entity within the matrix, automatically apply that percentage. And of course, that would then feed into the next VAT return. So there's lots of flexibility, there's lots of functions, but ultimately on system being able to create those rules and that logic to drive the automated application of those partial recoverability rates across the organisation.
No, that's it. So it's really good to see, Dane, because it's something that comes up, as I say, all the time in terms of that partial VAT. And again, going back to what myself and Dane said, that's really just scratching the surface with the automation piece within iplicit. So if you do have any questions around about any other areas that is maybe taking time at the moment in your charity, please do let us know. We can maybe even go into another few examples, but hopefully that's given a bit of an idea. And actually, you've been in that kind of purchase invoice there, maybe brings us on to the next kind of challenge area quite well, and one that comes up all the time. And again, what you're probably seeing here is that the reporting, the automation is then probably then feeding into the next one, because spend control and just overall governance is something that from speaking to charities over the last few years, especially with iplicit, can be really quite daunting and quite quite difficult in terms of being able to approve the likes of purchases. It might be purchase invoices, purchase orders. The approval workflows are getting more complex as the charity grows. So, for example, we had one where it used to be, it would just be an approval workflow would just be going to one person or one group of 2 people, I think it was. But now that has gone up because there's now budget holders involved, that there's now different area managers, there's different, it's really growing arms and legs, which is great for the charity, helping more people across the UK. But in terms of controlling the spend for different events and different things that they need to purchase, becomes a bit more difficult. So this whole spend control and governance piece is a real challenge. So we've pinpointed 3 kind of areas here, and like I said, workflows is really a big part of that. So whether it be purchases, whether it be expenses, having the workflow to control the spend against budget is really, really something that we've found that a lot of charities can struggle with. And it becomes quite a manual process where you're relying on emails, you're relying on maybe bits of paper going onto people's desks, you're waiting on someone approving before you can go further in the process. So it's just a bit inefficient, and this is where iplicit looks to help. There's also, we've seen quite a big difficulty in tracking budgets. So I'd say across the different industries that we speak to and serve, budgets for charities is really, really important, just to see where we're at against spend, funds, for example, which you touched on in the reporting piece, and how we're doing against that. So getting that budget versus actual report out at the end. And I suppose the last point on this, we've talked about our approval workflows, and I'm probably giving a little bit of a giveaway of what Dane might show. But one of the big bits about workflows is also having the governance and the visibility to see what's happened before. So a big question that we get, not just with charities, but with all organisations, is how can we see what's happened before within the system? So having that audit trail of who's approved what at what point and by whom, just so we've got all that within one place, and it's not becoming a case of digging through emails, on the phone to different people, Teams meetings with other people. Everything being in the one system is really, really important. So probably that gives a nice segue then into Dane, how iplicit can help with that whole spend control, whether it be purchases and looking at a bit of the budget reporting within iplicit, because I think a lot, hopefully we'll agree on the webinar that this area for charities in particular is something that's really, really important.
Yeah, and I think just adding to that, Tom, what was interesting speaking to a charitable organisation last week actually was when we showed them iplicit, how it can change the way in which they work. So they were saying that a lot of their purchase ordering and their processes around purchase orders was actually off system, whether that's spreadsheets, emails, and because there's a real fear around bringing that into the finance system, whether that's because there isn't the controls and governance to make it simple for those non-finance users. And with all of those controls that we have, we can actually bring all of that onto the system, having all the automation, having all of the audit trail and the governance, because we can make everything super simple and straightforward for those non-financial users to actually interact with the software. And I'll show you an example of that. So to your point, absolutely. If I was, let's say I'm in the shoes of the finance team, first and foremost, and I wanted to go and raise a purchase order. So I can come onto the system and I can go and raise my purchase order. And it's a really simple, straightforward form where I can select my supplier. I can enter a description. I can select the organisation I'm raising the PO for, because I may have data access rights that spans across all of the entities within the group. And then I can begin to add my lines on. So when we're adding lines on, we can either use what we call products, or we can select the account code. And again, products are fantastic for non-finance users because they're not having to worry about what account code do I use for this? What account code do I use for that? They can select from predefined common types of items that are labeled in layman's terms that are really simple and easy for them to use. And I'll come back to that in a moment. But ultimately, I can come on here. I can select my product or enter my account code. I can enter my quantities, my values. I've got all of my tracking codes or attributes coming through. I can go and add more lines on. So I'm just going to go and add an extra line here as an example. And of course, at the top, if we wanted to attach any supporting documentation or add any notes, we absolutely can. But as we're adding those lines on, we have this budget tab, which gives you, or the person entering their order request, real-time, instantaneous visibility of how that order is going to impact their underlying budget. So what the value of the order is, the actuals that we've processed to date, what their budget value is, and what that's going to leave them with, whether there's a remaining amount, whether it's going to take them over. So if I was to go and change this to say 600, we can now see that that's actually going to take us over our budget. And when we submit that through for authorization, we get validation and warning messages to let us know that that's the impact, but it still allows us it to go through for authorization at this point. And what you'll see here is that it comes into my queue in green, but you can now see that it's going through for authorization and sign off. And that's because within iplicit, we have completely configurable authorization workflows. And ultimately, our customers can decide where do they want a workflow to be applicable? Is it against an order request? Is it against an invoice, an expense claim, a payment run? And underneath that, we can drive the logic of how it flows through the organization to reach approval. So it could be multi-layered. It may be multi-layered based on value, department, cost center, entity, projects, whichever of those dimensions you wanted to use. Now, from a sign-off process, we have a full notification center within iplicit. So as soon as requests go on, I get a notification center. I can come in. I've got all of the information at my fingertips to do my due diligence. I can review the budget impact and approve or reject and add commentary. It's also worth noting that we've got automated emails with hyperlinks, so users can be out and about, click on the hyperlink, log in to sign these off. And we also have dedicated Apple and Android mobile apps where the authorizations and rejections can be driven out and about on the move, all through a mobile app as well. And what you'll see is once that's gone through that workflow, that invoice is now approved, but we have that full audit trail of every step of the way, when that was created, when it was submitted, and who signed it off at each stage of that workflow. So you've got a full audit trail from start to finish. Now, if I was to just log in very quickly as a separate user, so I'm going to log in as a non-financial user now and put myself in the shoes of a department head or someone with a different department. So first of all, you can see we've got much more diluted access rights. Every area of iplicit we can restrict to make it super simple and easy for those non-financial users doing the activity that we want them to be logging within iplicit. When that non-financial user raises their order, we can see that because they're part of a entity or one of those companies within the group, that's what they're set to. So it automatically applies those rules. When I'm adding products on, these can all be defined against different teams. So you may have one team that only sees certain products and other teams that see other products. So again, it makes the selection criteria, it makes the data entry really simple and straightforward because they're only selecting from the areas that they have access to. And all of these columns along the top here can also be controlled as well. So for our non-finance teams, it may be we don't want to show anything relating to tax or VAT. All they need to see is product, quantity, and value. And it can be as simple and as straightforward as that. So it's all configurable, it's flexible, and built to suit the way in which your teams want to view and interact with the software.
No, just to add, as you're saying there, it's a really, really interesting point you make about the non-finance users, and that's something that comes up all the time because typically when we're looking at charities, the team's small and they might not be doing all of the purchasing. So having that access for non-finance users and making it as easy as possible for them is really, really important because even for teams, the easier it is for people who are not finance user, the more adoption there's going to be and the more streamlined the whole process is going to be. So it's not even just about having the functionality, it's making it easy for those people. So it's a really, really interesting point you make. And I think it is quite an interesting point because I do see there's a few questions came through as you were doing that there. So we'll get to those, I promise, at the end of the session. I think there was a couple of questions that came up on that whole approval but full piece. As I say, it's something that comes up all the time.
Sorry, Tom, like we were talking as well, you know, those users don't even need to come into the core platform. We've got mobile apps where order requests, approvals can all be driven through Android or Apple devices. So even for those users that we don't want coming into the core platform and need that flexibility to be on the move doing these things, we've got the apps that can drive that flexibility as well. So lots of options for the features those users need.
Lovely, lovely. And as I say, we'll get to those questions. As I say, conscious of time, so we'll get through the last two little pieces before opening up to the questions. And I can see there's quite a few that have come through. Kind of final pieces we'll work on are like the likes of projects and grant management. Again, this comes up quite heavily when we speak to charities. In fact, spoke to one last week who ran a lot of events and had to really decipher how much revenue, how much cost was against running these events, because they're quite sizable. So albeit we could probably do that through like GL codes and things, through those reporting, having an actual project piece within the software was going to be really important to them. So some of the challenges that we see are around that, and also grant management as well. So we speak to a lot of customers and a lot of charities, of course, are taking in grants to run certain projects. So having the software be able to track those a little bit easier, and it comes back to that fund reporting piece as well. There's a bit of crossover there, and again, how these challenges all interlink into the system. But having actual one area of the system, so whether it be a project that module, again, probably giving away a bit of what we'll show in a second. It makes it really easy just to have everything in one place, as opposed to then having to build reports. Everything's in the one area, and you can just see for this event, for this project that has been funded for specifically by this grant, this is how it's impacted, this is the impact that it's having, and this is the cost of it, and this is the revenue and donations we've had against that. So I don't know if it's worth just jumping into the software. I know it's quite a whistle-stop tour of that kind of challenge, but it's probably, once you've actually seen it, it comes to life a little bit more, I find, when we talk about projects and grant management.
Yeah, and I think just to add to that, ultimately, the project or the grant that we're wanting to make, it's just another tracking dimension, just like the fund or the cost centre or department. It's just another dimension that we're wanting to tag and capture transactions against to give us that consolidated view. And you're absolutely right, Tom. We've got a dedicated projects area of iplicit, and we've got lots of different charities that utilise this for different types of activity. So, for example, one may be, as an example, there may be events that they put on throughout the course of the year where they're wanting to track expenditure and maybe some income or donations around those events. There may be infrastructure projects that we have going on within the organisation where we want to track that as well. New buildings, new things that we're putting together for the charity. So lots of different use cases. But ultimately, within a project, it gives us that central source and view of everything that's happened against that project. So along the top here, we can add attachments, we can add notes against the project, we can create milestones that we can use to analyse from a reporting point of view. Where are we with that project and what are the stages that we need to go through? This is all controlled by users again. So again, we have the flexibility of who has access to these projects and who can actually tag transactions against these projects. And we also have custom fields. So you can create any fields that you want to be able to store that data against the project within iplicit. And ultimately, we're then tagging transactions against that project, whether that's an event, whether it's an infrastructure project, whether it's tracking grant receipts and payments for a particular grant. It's tagging all of those different transactions and consolidating them all within one view. So I can see every transaction that's tied to that project, and I can come in here and filter it by transaction type. I could filter it by period, or use any of these headers along the top to filter based on those as well. We can see all of the purchase orders that have been raised for that project. We can see any sales orders, if applicable, if we're selling anything. We can see that's tied to the project. And ultimately, what is that is giving in is we can see our commitments. So on our purchase orders, we can see what have we ordered, what have we been invoiced, and what's outstanding. So you get live real-time commitment analysis by project. But to Tom's point, it's then giving you that financial breakdown of all of your income, all of your expenditure for that project to show us what we're tracking to or what that financial picture looks like. And again, just like when you saw for the reporting piece earlier, We can drag and drop our dimensions to configure this in a way in which we want to view the data. And it's also fully interactive, where we can drill in and see all of those source transactions that's actually feeding into that project. And whether it's a P&L, whether it's a TB that we want to analyze by project, we consolidate all of that data into a dedicated projects area. And it's the exact same for things like grants and grant awarding grants. So if I was to come here, I've got a small cash grants. So I can come in here, I've got that as a project. And what that allows me to view is see all of the income and expenditure specifically for that grant. So when any donations are received, I can see how much donation were received. I can see the journal or the transaction in which that donation came in on. And when we made any payments out to recipients of that grant or donation, again, we can see who received the money, how much we paid out. And again, we can drill into the source transactions from here as well. So a fantastic function for consolidating all of those financial transactions in a single source, and then giving us flexible live analysis and reporting specifically on all of those projects we have within the organisation.
Oh, love it. I really love this module, Damien. As you say, because you can use it for different things, so it is called the projects module, but it might be to track events, and as you say, we can kind of double up to look at grants. And the beauty of it is, and I think that I'm seeing this across the, obviously I've worked with iplicit, I've seen it across the demonstration aspect of the webinar this morning, just the usability. So again, coming back to that first challenge of reporting and visibility, even with using the other modules, that all kind of ties in to how easy it is to get to the information that you're looking for. And the projects module is a good example of that, bringing it into one area and just making sure we've got that visibility of that event, that grant, that project that the charity's undertaken. And you spoke about donations there, and that probably comes on to our kind of final point of integration to our systems, because it is likely that that we speak to charities who are using third-party systems. So I'll list a few. For example, Razor's Edge is one that we find all the time for that kind of CRM side. DonorFi, the likes of Just Giving. So all of these donation platforms are being used, and I know at least one person that's on the webinar this morning is using one of those. I've spoken to them previously. And a big challenge for them is integrating what they already have to the potential finance system or their current finance system. So what we see, and especially in charitable organisations, is a bit of lack of integration, mainly because systems have maybe been in place for a long time and then added to as a need has become bigger. So for example, we've needed a donation platform because that's the way that the world's going in terms of getting money into the charity, but then that's disconnected with the finance system. So the ultimate utopia is having everything connected together, because iplicit isn't a fundraising platform, it's not a donations platform. So these systems that have been built are brilliant at doing that, but then how can we easily then integrate it across? So what we're seeing at the moment, bit of disconnection within the systems, manual data transfer, as we said before, prone to errors, prone to mistakes if we're doing it twice or even sometimes more than twice. Data gaps, what system is correct? What one is actually showing us what is the correct information and where we're getting the right information from? And it just means we've got a lack of insight. So the reports that we're getting, are they actually accurate? Because we're not reflecting what we've taken from another system. So all of these things all build up to this real key challenge of there is a total lack of integration, and we feel that across the different charities that we speak to. So how can we help with that? And this is probably more for ourselves at Eureka in conjunction with iplicit, that we can look to tackle together. So iplicit's great because it's got a really, really strong API, not to get too technical and bog anyone down with lots of technical jargon, but a really strong API, making it easy for us and making it easy for you to integrate different systems into iplicit. And the way we do that is using a tool that we've actually helped develop that helps iplicit and helps charities alike, called Syncly. So that essentially sits between iplicit and some of the third-party charity-specific platforms you may be using. And it can be used for other use cases as well. But in this instance, looking at things like your Donify, Just Giving, it might be Razor's Edge, and even other CRM systems that you might be using. So I use donations as a really strong example there. You might be getting donations that come through Just Giving and then go into Razor's Edge and then have to make their way to the finance system in whatever format, whether that's, say, a cash say, a journal, whatever that format might be. And that's something that we would scope out. But essentially basically sits between those to automate the data transfer. And that might be every day, it might be once a day, it might be twice a day, it might be every 5 minutes. We can talk to you in terms of how that would work best. Of course, every integration is different. Everyone's using different platforms. So we would work with you to make sure that's done effectively. But I guess for today's webinar and making sure that for that awareness side of things is knowing that is 100% fully possible and something that we can certainly help with. And that probably just brings us to near the close. I know we're coming up to the hour. Myself and Dane do like to speak, so we've done well to keep to the hour. Well, just about. So just to kind of summarise in terms of how iplicit solves some of these kind of key challenge points, and hopefully we've hit some of those key areas that maybe are affecting you on a day-to-day. It might be that reporting and compliance, as you see, that actually had a real knock-on in other areas. For example, the automation of those reports and the governance that the reports give you. So that reporting piece, I think, is really, really important in terms of being able to get the data out of the system in an effective format, and for the likes of SORP and SOFA to be compliant with what charities need to do. We looked at that whole automation piece and we just scratched the surface there in terms of what we can do with iplicit. And that really led on nicely to how iplicit deals with the likes of approval workflows and that automation of those to give us the governance of budgets and making sure that the spend within the charity is controlled. And then finished off with the likes of project and grant management, bringing everything into one area, making sure that we can track events, track grants, and make sure we've got that visibility. Again, a little bit of the reporting coming into that as well. And finished off with a little bit on integration and how we can integrate to other systems. And I guess in just a final piece in terms of how we work with iplicit, it's probably a nice segue having talked about Syncly. So we've been a partner for different software solutions and been a partner for the last few years with iplicit. So one of the leading partners for the team at iplicit. We help them with implementations. We do, of course, we would do the whole implementation project. If you were to move to iplicit or want to look at iplicit, we would do the whole implementation, the training, the ongoing support for iplicit. As you can probably hear from my accent, not Dane's, that we are based in Scotland, so just outside of Glasgow, but have outreach all over the UK. So more than happy to do any implementation days and things on site and really have that kind of face-to-face. We're all about building up relationships. Many of our customers have been with us for a number of years, and two kind of key founding principles on that. I can just see a comments come through saying lovely accent, so thank you. Now, I'd get distracted there. You shouldn't get distracted, but thank you very much. And as I say, we've been doing this for a number of years, and two kind of key principles are customer service and technical expertise. And hopefully you've seen that across today, especially with that technical expertise. So we've been doing this for a long time. So if you were wanting to speak to us further about iplicit, please do reach out. You can see my name and contact details there on the screen. All it's left to say is a big thank you to Dane for joining us and for being so insightful with the demonstration of iplicit. I'm sure you'll agree it's been great to look at the software in a bit more detail and how it covers those challenges. And a big thank you to everyone for joining us on this morning, and have a lovely rest of the day. And if there's any questions, please do reach out.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me, Tom. Really enjoyed it, and thank you for everyone for joining. It's been great. Have a great rest of the day, everybody.
Lovely. Thank you very much, guys.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Take care. Goodbye.